Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Welcome, everybody, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I am so excited to have Tony Cooke in the house. We're going to talk a lot about leadership and relationships. Who knows where this conversation will go, but it will be awesome. Tony, great to have you, man.
Patrick, thank you. Good to be with you.
You've written a book on relationships that have to do with how they integrate into some of the great stories of the Bible. And the leader and leadership paradigms of the Bible. So I'm just going to let you kind of kick off some of the thoughts that you have around it, and then I'll jump around and see what I can do to help guide.
Yeah, we'll both jump around.
Let's do it. Do a lot of jumping.
You know, when you study the Bible, it is so clear how paramount relationships are.
Yeah.
And one thing about the Bible is it makes no attempt to candy coat or sugarcoat anything.
Yeah.
You know, it gives us the raw reality, and yet it still then will bring in redemption.
Yes.
And for example, you know, Cain and Abel, right off the bat. You know, Cain kills Abel. Before that, Adam blamed Eve.
Yes.
And you don't go very far in the scripture until you have, you know, the Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau, and even back further, Lot's servants not getting along with Abraham's servants. And then you get up to Job and his three friends that just, you know, demolish him verbally when he's lost everything.
Yeah.
And then you follow through David and the betrayal that he had with Absalom, and Judas being betrayed with a kiss, and you know, the thread of sin affecting relationships is so integral to the biblical story, and yet Jesus comes along and is asked a question, what's the great commandment? Yeah. And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Jesus answered the question, but he didn't stop there. He said, and the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
And then Jesus said, you know, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. And so Jesus puts this team together of people who didn't necessarily get along very well.
Yeah. And
you have the competitiveness, the arguing which of them is the greatest. You have James wanting to call down fire on people and destroy them. You have Peter cutting off a guy's ear. I mean, it's almost like, you know, the Keystone Cops. And yet Jesus wanted to bring out some unity and teamwork from those guys.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until they got born again and filled with the Spirit that, you know, you have Peter and John going together to pray, and you begin to get, you know, some cohesiveness.
Yeah.
But the Bible is so clear about, you know, it is so easy to fall out with people, and you just look in the world today and the strife and the division and the backbiting and the backstabbing and things like that. And we're called to do better than that in the body of Christ.
Yeah.
We're called to a higher standard. And so we end up, this little book, Relationships Matter, we end up focusing on Paul and the relationships he had.
Wow.
And some were good, some were bad, some were ugly.
Yeah.
But Paul himself is such an amazing story because he wasn't exactly Mr. Congeniality.
Yeah.
You know, he wasn't necessarily a peacemaker. You know, before he got born again, I mean, he describes himself as the worst sinner imaginable. You know, he talks about he abused people. He hurt people. He calls himself injurious, and yet he did it sincerely.
Yeah.
You know, he thought he was doing the right thing by treating people harshly and, you know, with a punitive attitude and things like that. But he didn't play well with others.
Yeah.
Let's just borrow that term from our early report cards.
Yeah. Hey everybody, I want to slide right in here and thank you for joining us for today's episode. Let me ask you for a huge favor. If this podcast is providing value to you, would you consider subscribing to it wherever you get your podcasts? Also, if you feel that it would be valuable to somebody else, please like it, comment on it, and share it on your social media feeds like YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you populate networking. And one more big favor. If you like the show, please go review it. And if it's true for you, give us 5 stars. And when you review it and rate it, it gives our efforts greater opportunity to grow, and that would mean the world to us. Now let's go back to this week's episode. You know, with our background, with some of the most amazing influencers of our lives, there's times that we can see leadership not always being about leading groups or empowering people. Sometimes there are people that are content leaders. And content leaders will always, their influence can hit a ceiling. But the people that tend to multiply in numerical influences are people that are very mindful of relationships. So, you know, you just went through that whole laundry list of people that had dysfunction and people that were crazy at odds and different reasons they were at odds. And it literally sounds like a pastor trying to pastor a church.
Right.
And all of the different nuances and, you know, people that bring so many wounds and painful moments of their life forward. And they're trying to make sense of their life, and they project that onto other people to own the responsibility to get them reset and back to normal. And so my heart resonates with that side of it. I'm grateful for the content that I've had led into my life. But I can say that one area that I feel like I didn't get privileged with is to have the relational mentoring. The mentoring that was all about empowerment. Even the leaders that I knew one-to-one, have known, they are people that, you know, probably scaled up some on maybe a narcissistic scale. And so there wasn't this empowerment. I remember one time a guy says to me that I really appreciated and loved, I'd gotten a call from a pastor who was struggling with something going on in his church. And I tell this, you know, friend of mine that was a pastoral role to me about it. And he says, well, just have him call me. And it just felt so disempowering. And then, you know, the critiques that you would get in non-relational ways of, you know, if you do whatever some of the progressive churches are doing, then you're an idiot kind of a statement. And what I said back is, you know, what I would really like to have heard is for you to say, if you think God's leading you to do something, let me surround you and we'll pick you up if you fall, but try it because we believe in you. And I never got privileged with that. And so I never got to experiment. You know, I pastored my first church, Tony, when I'm 21 years old and single. And anytime I share that with anybody, I shared it with some young people recently in another state, and they were like comparing themselves against it. Like, you guys have no idea. A 21-year-old who's pastoring a church might mean that a 21-year-old doesn't have anybody to mentor them. And you could have saved years and been much more successful on the long term if you had had that. So let's think about some of those elements of what goes into empowerment. What are some of the potholes that maybe you look at in your book around what keeps leaders from wanting to empower other people, and where are the problems? Where do they sit? And how do we overcome them?
Yeah, I think we chose Paul. The subtitle of this book, it's called, well, the title is Relationships Matter, and the subtitle is Lessons from Paul and the People Who Impacted His Life. And honestly, we don't even go into Gamaliel. I should have done that.
Amazing.
So it's just a reason for people not to buy this book. But you know, Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel, and Gamaliel had a compassion and a wisdom that Paul did not have in his younger years.
Yeah.
And how many of us, when we were young and maybe brash and omniscient
Yes.
and arrogant, we knew everything.
Yes.
We were very rigid, you know. And I think in a sense, people want to put Paul on a pedestal, like, you know, he's right there with Jesus. But Paul admits his own faults, you know, about how he abused the church and that type of thing. But that personality, that rigidity and that type of thing, didn't necessarily just stop the second he got born again.
Yeah, right.
As a young leader, for example, Paul on his first missionary journey with Barnabas. Now, Barnabas was, his name was not Barnabas. That was a nickname. His name is Joseph. And Barnabas was a nickname that the apostles gave him, which means the son of encouragement.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Barnabas was kind of the ultimate
He was a networker.
networker, but a mentor.
Yeah.
He believed.
Oh, wow.
He believed in Paul when nobody believed in Paul.
Yeah.
When everybody was afraid of him and thought his conversion was fake.
Interesting.
He said, Paul, come on, I'm going to take you and introduce you to the... When Barnabas brought him to the apostles, they didn't want to deal with Paul.
Yeah.
But Barnabas believed in the underdog, and he poured his life into, you know, when the Gentiles started getting saved, and the apostles in Jerusalem weren't really sure, you know, I mean, can they be saved without becoming... the Bible says they sent Barnabas to visit these Gentiles who had gotten saved. And the Bible says that when Barnabas came, he saw the grace of God and was glad. The ability, you know, and I'm not trying to put Barnabas up above Paul, because Paul obviously had his phenomenal accomplishments as well. But you know, when Paul and Barnabas are together, they're Acts 13 through 15, that type of thing. And John Mark,
Here we go.
young minister, maybe a little bit of a mama's boy.
Yeah.
You know, his mom was like the key church leader in Jerusalem, other than the apostles. Everything happened at her house. And here's Mark on this first missionary journey. Mark fails. You know, Mark goes with Paul and Barnabas all across the island of Cyprus. Cyprus is beautiful. I've preached there. It is it's like your first missionary assignment is to Maui.
Oh, wow.
You know,
Wow.
and so Mark goes with them across the island, and during that time, Paul's leadership just surges. And it had been Barnabas and Paul, but then it becomes Paul and Barnabas. And we don't know why, but when they left Paphos on the western end of Cyprus and go up to the southern coast of what today is Turkey, Mark's done. He's this young kid, he's done. And we don't know, was he offended at Paul being so dominant, or was he afraid? We don't know. There's all kinds of speculation. But what we know is that Mark left and went home to Mama in Jerusalem. A couple years later, they're going to go back and retrace their route and go check on all the churches. And Barnabas says, let's bring Mark. And Paul says, no way.
Yeah.
And Paul refused. Now, if you want to get a theological argument going amongst a bunch of ministers, just casually throw, I wonder who is right, Paul or Barnabas? You know, and it's to me, I don't know that there's a hyper definitive answer. You know, the Bible says every man's way is right in his own eyes, and people tend to say that Paul was right. But here's the thing, Paul was 100% task-oriented. And I don't know if that's what you meant by content-oriented, or if there's some similarity there. Paul was task-oriented. Barnabas was relationship-oriented. And he wasn't going to, if Mark can't go, I'm not going. And they split. So, two wonderful men, outstanding men of God, and yet they have a big falling out, and it's over. How are we going to treat this young guy?
Yeah.
And it's easy for people to say because history follows Paul.
Yeah.
Luke follows Paul.
Yeah.
But at the end of 2 Timothy chapter 4, and this is one of the things we talk about in the book, at the very end, the last letter and the last chapter that Paul ever writes, he says to Timothy, get Mark and bring him with you because he's profitable to me for the ministry. So something happened.
Yeah.
I think a couple things happened. I think number one, I think Mark grew up. I think Mark matured.
Yeah.
But I think Paul mellowed.
Yeah.
I think Paul learned. Paul had been 100% task-oriented, maybe, but he learned to be more relationship-oriented. And he didn't make if that was a mistake, some people, if you say Paul made a mistake, they're like, oh, blasphemy. But if Paul made a mistake in not cutting Mark some slack, he rectified that. He learned to be more compassionate, more patient with Timothy.
Yeah.
And Timothy had his own set of weaknesses, on several fronts.
You bet.
But Paul learned, I believe, you can't just be 100% task-oriented. You also have to bring people along in the journey.
Yeah.
And that means that sometimes you have to exercise a lot of patience. You have to give people room to grow. Now, the reason that Mark was able to grow was not because of Paul. Paul cut him off.
Yeah.
The reason Mark was able to grow is because Barnabas put his arm around Mark's shoulder and said, hey, let's go back to Cyprus.
Yeah.
And he nurtured him. Can you imagine the level of rejection that Mark would have had to deal with?
Oh my God.
Being rejected by Paul. And then, Paul becomes the ultimate apostle.
Yeah.
And yet, Mark could have been, as it were, branded failure, reject, unacceptable.
Yeah.
But that's not the way the story turned out, because there was a compassionate person that came in named Barnabas who nurtured and developed.
Yeah.
So to me, to see Paul go, through this whole evolution of, number one, being the harshest, fiercest persecutor of the Christians, to becoming an apostle of Christ, but maybe in his youthful ministry, the early stages, being maybe too rigid, maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But then obviously toward the end of his ministry, he had developed that gentleness, that fathering. To me, there's so much to learn there. Through that whole episode.
Yeah. Let me jump in again and tell you about two amazing opportunities for pastors, spouses, and senior leaders of ministry that will increase your leadership. And they're both free. I'm talking about monthly Zooms and also weekly process groups. First, we hold a monthly Zoom event that is 1+ hours with Dr. Todd Bowman, a psychologist and human behavior expert, and me. We usually have around 15 to 30 other participating pastors, spouses, and leaders. The monthlies have been amazing to help pastors collaborate around tactics, personnel challenges, and even how to navigate our own inner world. The skills you'll learn and a newfound pastoral community will expand your leadership mapping with everybody you lead. These monthly Zooms happen every month on the second Mondays at 6 p.m. Central Time. And then the second opportunity for pastors and spouses is our weekly process group that spans for 6 weeks. In our weekly process group, we provide tools that guide you into your story and help you rediscover you, redefine leadership, redeem life, and redream ministry. Weekly process groups give time to open your stories as you collect the dots, connect the dots, and correct the dots. Attunement begins with you making sense of your story. When you live with mindful attunement to your story, you'll find that the people you lead will begin to also make leadership sense to you in profound new ways. Our alumni tell us that this is one of the most impactful experiences they have ever had. We place ladies in groups of 6 to 10, and also we put men in groups of 6 to 10. The value of the weekly experience is $900+ per person. However, in this season, we're offering it to you for free. You can see some of our alumni sharing stories on our events web pages. You can find out everything you need to know to get involved in either the monthlies or the weekly process groups by going to redinkrevival.com. I hope to see you there soon. Well, you know, the scripture says that you have, 10,000 teachers, but you have not many fathers.
Right.
And to me, when you look at how the profile of a relationship would be, that's what I mean with a content leader.
Right.
A content leader is somebody who teaches you, lectures, kind of the professor, but the content is so radical and impactful that it changes the quality of your life. So you have deep indebtedness.
Right.
But they also may be unavailable for that role that you would now think of as a father, somebody who sees you, knows you, feels you, somebody who believes in you when you don't believe in you, somebody who challenges you when you feel like you are cruising right along, somebody that holds you accountable, that loves you enough to look you in the eye and say, what you're doing is not up to standard for what you need to be reaching into. But doing it in a way where the person isn't demoralized, but they're feeling the fact that you cared enough about them to challenge them to grow. And I think about, myself, at Red Ink Revival, we have a lot of studying of our historical stories. We say we collect the dots, connect the dots, and correct the dots. And you can't really move forward to understand other people till you know your own story. And in my story, I do have enough wounds from childhood up that my brain organized how to survive and belong around that. And so when I think of, even as a pastor, I feel anxiety at times come up when it's necessary to hold somebody accountable.
Right.
Because it's the threat of betrayal. It's the threat that the person now will not maintain.
Yeah.
And so I, over the years, have let some things go by. It depends on what the relationship is or who it is. But when I look at some of the organizations where the pastor is well known for their leadership development, they don't let an inch go by without calling something out, but loving a person through it, and believing them, in them through it. So when you, think about that, of, how important it is that a quality leader be a person who is relationally functional around vulnerability and around holding accountability with those who you've given certain delegations, quality control, and so on. When you think of that kind of thing, you've been an associate pastor for years and years. You've been the dean of a Bible college. You have been over a ministerial organization that has hundreds and hundreds of churches. You were the one who had to, help navigate all the problems that would, be going on in churches from the organization. So when you think about that, and think about things that are in your book, are there tie-ins to help us think, how do we grow in relationship with the people that we're leading when we have these, tremors of anxiety that come up?
Yeah. When you talk about the anxiety that comes up, I remember reading one survey indicating that the number one thing that pastors hate, it's part of their job that they have to do, but it's the number one thing, is confrontation.
Oh, man.
And unfortunately, I've known some people that loved confrontation. They just were looking for somebody, and those people scare me, because they just, amputate, first, ask questions later, things like that. But honestly, I think there's a spectrum of being a relationship-oriented person and a task-oriented person.
Yeah.
And I think we have to have some fluidity on knowing when to focus more on the relationship and when to focus more on the task.
Yeah.
You show me a leader that is not somewhat task-oriented, that he just wants to be everybody's best friend. I want everybody to like me. They're not going to be an effective leader.
We're not going anywhere.
They're going to be a good old boy, you know, that type of thing. You know, the best leaders communicate standards and expectations. And I'm not talking about a hyper fear, you know, type of thing. But because we're giving our best for Jesus, and because, you know, we do have this thing called the Great Commission that we're endeavoring to fulfill, and because we're going to give an account to God, you know, we do want to be growing. We do want to be making progress. So the task-oriented side of a leader means that, you know, these people that God has placed under my care and charge, then number one, I'm going to endeavor to nurture them, but I'm also going to challenge them. If all I do is challenge them, you know, I think it kind of ties into what Paul said about parents. You know, fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. You know, don't exasperate them. You know, you can have such a high standard that you're pushing people toward that they feel they can never measure up, and they may try out of fear or whatever to do that, but you know, you may burn them out real badly, and they're not receiving any. People need to know who they are as a person, not just what they can produce for an organization. So I think at some point there's a balance, finding where we need to be task-oriented, when we need to be empathetic toward the human side, and maybe one person doesn't always do all that. I heard, I'll tell you who this is afterwards, I won't say it on camera, but I heard about a great leader who I never worked with, but has long since gone to be with the Lord, but just a pretty temperamental, angry guy. And he was driven, and he drove others. And that sometimes he would just get so ticked off that he would storm through the office and say, "You're fired, and you're fired, and you're fired," and just go through, and I mean, just, you know, kind of terrorize everybody. And his wife would always come through a couple minutes later and say, "Hey, honey, you're okay. You're not fired. Don't worry." You know, and she would be, you know, she would kind of be the Barnabas in the situation, you know. So maybe sometimes this perfect, you know, standard is not always there of being able to do the task orientation and the people connection, but ultimately people need both, whether it comes from the same person or a combination, you know.
How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. Tina is a certified expert that will help you with clarifying financial dreams, understanding spending patterns, reviewing all financial obligations, assessing financial and insurance needs, defining a spending plan, understanding your emotional profile related to money, building margin for savings and emergency funds, learning strategies for attacking debt, and referring recommended financial advisors to multiply your tomorrow. And she isn't selling any products, policies, or investments. She is the ultimate financial teammate. As Tina's husband of 30 years, I can tell you firsthand how much of a difference Tina's skills and giftings have made. Our financial portfolio wouldn't be a fraction of what it is today if it wasn't for her. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. I've known executives of Fortune 500 companies that manage billion-dollar budgets at work, but then come home to complete financial disorder and disappointments. Shame roars at them as they face the stresses of marriage, kids, and struggling retirement plans. A personal trainer can change the way you think, emote, and behave. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you will do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details. Well, I think that part of what has been frustrating at times for me is, I go to leadership conferences, I go to read books, listen to podcasts, and this exact scenario that we're talking about, it just feels so fluid. I'm one who likes to have everything in a category, in a box. I want it absolutes. I want to have something that is objective and not just subjective. And yet, what you're talking about is so the human experience. It's unpredictable. People will pivot in ways that you never knew. I remember one time I was bleeding internally, emotionally, in a season when some people had left our church, transitioned out, that I thought we would be together forever. Yeah. And thought, that when we're in our 70s, we would be sitting on the porch somewhere talking about the good old days of what God had done. And when they left, again, I'm bleeding, and which, when I bleed, just for the sake of the audience to know, when I bleed around things with rejection and betrayal, it isn't in the highest energy parts of it, isn't in that moment. It's from my backstory forward. So all of that gets carried and it exaggerates the moment. So I'm bleeding. I am in California hanging out with a group of ministers, and one of my friends who's a psychologist, he was there and he asked me if I'd take him to LAX, to the airport that evening, and I said, sure. So I get him in the car and I'm like, hey man, I just want you to know I'm happy. I can't tell you, as my friend, we're close. I said, I'm thrilled I get to drive you to LAX, but I do want you to know you're on the clock. And I'm going to get some therapy here. Bartering. Yeah. That's right. And I said, I told him the story and kind of how I was bleeding. And he said this to me. He said, well, Patrick, he said, I know you well enough already. He said, I know that for you, you're such a scientist at mind. You like to watch things that are predictable, measurable, repeatable. And he said, when somebody leaves your church, you have a tendency to want to analyze why and look for the objective reasoning so that your brain can go around it and fix it for the next cycle. And because you can't fix it for the next cycle, you sit in suffering. And I was like, wow, yeah, that's true. He said, the thing is that you want an objective reason that people transition, and the people themselves don't know why, because of all that goes into their stories, all of the pain they've experienced, and for whatever reason, they are in some level of decision making, and you are wanting to know what you did or didn't do. And the truth is, it probably has nothing to do with you overall. Right. And so you're going to have to let go of how you're seeing it that way. And again, for me, when I would go to pastors' conferences and they would talk about these things, it would frustrate me because I wanted so badly for there to be categoric objectivity as to, again, why people would do what they do. Today, I think with what I understand and what we lead pastors through in our 6-week modules of process groups and helping them understand their history is if I had a staff member that was upset today or a volunteer, and usually what you pick up first is you pick up things that are metrics. They don't seem to show up with the energy they once showed up with. They tend to bounce their eyes. They tend to shift in their giving. Their serving roles begin to shift. And if I have access to them, which some people I wouldn't, but if I have access to them and have a conversation just of, how are you doing? How's life going? You can tell often, what their emotional presentation is. If they are intense and there's anger, that's actually a good thing, which we're not always taught that.
Right.
And we're taught that that's unchristian. But if there's any kind of intensity there, then you can lean in on it and say, I'm experiencing that you are, it sounds like you might be a little angry. Are you feeling unseen, unknown, unloved, unvalidated, disempowered? What can we explore just a little bit about where this emotion is coming from?
Right.
And if we can get to where that's coming from, they immediately feel empathized with, and that then tends to calm whatever it was. One thing that popped up in my mind is Tina Bryson, her and Dr. Dan Siegel are kind of the foremost thinkers in child development psychology, and they've written many books on attachment and so on, and I'm in a group with Tina, and she's mentoring a group of about 10 to 15 of us, and one of the people in the group asked the question about siblings. This is amazing to me. Siblings that are in the home still, they're school-age kids, and sometimes they just get so mad at each other. And, this is a Christian person in the group who is asking, well, what do you do about that? And this is what Tina said. And I thought it was so interesting. She said, well, actually, if they are angry at each other and they're presenting anger, you as a parent need to be real happy about that. Because what it means is I still value who you are enough to present myself to you in the disappointment of whatever's going on. The worst thing you can have is when siblings begin to diminish or dismiss and not care and not show emotion around it, because what that means is that when they leave the house, they're not going to give a rip about each other.
Shut you out of my life.
Yes, and shut it down. Well, I think about that as a leader, that if you as a leader have people who will not present any kind of emotional happening, that could actually be more dangerous, or two staff people who won't, present. And so having there's a book called Radical Candor, to have candor and a culture where we can talk, and then as a leader, to be able to watch people's emotions more than the data, because, people will come to you and tell you stuff, and for me, my logical brain gets on, and then it's like, I'm going to crush you. That's what I tend to do, is I'll crush somebody for the ignorant, thoughtless data that they're bringing. Well, the reality is that's the best that their cognitive brain came up with, but their emotional spinning that has put them in that space, that needs to be validated and seen. And every time I win the battle in the cognitive side, I lose the battle in the relational side. And so what I've endeavored to do these days is learn to pick up on the radar what the emotions are in the person, and repair where is necessary for the relational part, and care about the person. And that doesn't mean that they get everything they want. What it does mean is that you need to be seen, felt, and heard. And if you don't feel like I care about you, which my personality, I think I can project at times like, I've got too many things to really care about you. Well, if somebody's got emotional, something happening there, if I can lean in on that, I can repair that. and then we can succeed.
Yeah.
So again, as I'm looking at the things you're talking about, I pull out of my own story the relativity of it. And so you, again, back to ministry that you have led in, that you've been in, how does all that play out in your story of ways that you began to realize that it wasn't even the data that they were presenting that was the issue?
Yeah. A verse that came to mind while you were sharing that was Romans 12:18, where Paul said, if it is possible.
Yeah.
Now, when you're from a background of faith, the word if is not even acceptable.
Right.
Because we like, and understandably, we like what Jesus said, with God, all things are possible.
Yeah, possible.
So where does Paul get off saying, if it is possible?
Yeah.
And, I hold those in contrast, and I believe in the integrity and the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture and so on. So there's not a contradiction there.
Right.
It just looks like there is.
Yeah.
Jesus said, with God, all things are possible.
Yeah.
With God, all things are
possible. Yeah.
Paul wasn't talking about dealing with God.
Yeah.
He said, if it is possible, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men.
Yeah.
With God, all things are possible. With men or
Not
people, maybe not. They're talking about two different things.
Right.
And, what makes it possible?
Yeah.
Well, part of what makes it possible to have a relationship and to live peaceably is a degree of mutuality. Yeah. Relationships are a two-way street.
Yeah.
But you really were hitting on something really important, Patrick, and you talking about your journey and your learning process and your development just as a human being, and your acquisition of knowledge over the years. This knowledge that you're talking about, which a lot of it is self-awareness.
Yes.
And self-awareness, when people are not self-aware, there's going to be a lot of relationships that don't work out.
Yeah, right.
But if there's some self-awareness and some self-management and some self-development and fruit of the Spirit and, these things, that the qualities that the Bible, communicates, just like Paul talking about, kind of learning to be tolerant. That's not the word, but Ephesians 4, I'm not grabbing the right verbiage right now, but, basically saying cut each other some slack.
Yeah.
He's saying endeavor to maintain the unity of the peace.
Yes.
Yes. He implies you have to work at some of these relationships.
Yeah.
But to work without the right tools is really difficult.
Amazing.
When you have the right tools. Now, you talked about rejection. So Jesus knew rejection.
Yeah.
He came to his own received him not. In John chapter, I think it's fascinating, John chapter 6, verse 66. I'm not superstitious, but any passage of Scripture that goes with 666, you have to be concerned.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. I know the verses were added later. But it's where the Bible says, and so many people were leaving Jesus that he turned to Peter and said, do you want to leave also?
Yeah.
Jesus knew rejection.
Yeah.
And Paul knew rejection. Paul had been so hostile against the Christians. And but later, this section that we study in the book, 2 Timothy 4, Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, come quickly because Demas has forsaken me. And Timothy, Paul did give an excuse there, a reason. He said, because he has loved this present world. When we have degrees of insecurity, and who doesn't or who hasn't, we take everything personally, and everything is a reflection on us.
Yeah.
I remember the time in my life where I came to the realization sometimes when somebody acts a certain way that I would take as hurtful, it's not really a reflection on me, it's a reflection of who they are.
Yeah.
I don't have to take ownership. Now, I think it's always good to do a little soul searching and asking, but ultimately, sometimes when people act ugly, it's because they ugly.
Right.
Or they have some pain, whatever.
Absolutely.
It may not be something I did.
Yeah.
And there you have Jesus saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that was interesting because they knew exactly what they were doing. They were nailing that guy to the cross. They knew what they were doing, but on another level, they didn't.
Right.
On sometimes a certain level, people know what they're doing, but another level, they don't know what they're doing. So Paul said, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world.
Yeah.
Well, Paul was in the worst shape he'd ever been in his life. He's in the Mamertine prison in Rome. I've been in that. It is a pit. It is a dungeon pit. And in Paul's day, it probably would have had some backed up sewage in it. And he's sitting there and he's saying, everybody has forsaken me. 2 Timothy 1, all those in Asia have turned away from me, among whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. 2 Timothy 4, he says, Demas has forsaken me. Then a little bit later in chapter 4, he says, at my first trial, no one stood with me. All men forsook me.
Wow.
If that's not partaking of the sufferings of Christ, that Paul talked about in different places. But Jesus is our model, and Jesus was so secure in his relationship with the Father that I think he felt, the Bible says he's touched with the feelings of our infirmities, and Jesus was not an emotionless robot.
Yeah.
But Jesus was so aware of and confident in the Father's acceptance that rejection and abandonment that he faced, it wasn't able to lodge in him.
Yeah.
Did he feel it? I think he felt it, because even in the Garden of Gethsemane, you see Jesus human.
Yeah.
The humanity saying, couldn't you watch with me 1 hour?
Yeah.
There's a disappointment there.
Yeah.
But there was an overriding sense of relationship with the Father, purpose, mission, that even though he felt the disappointment, he didn't get derailed by the disappointment.
Yeah.
And so, the Bible says Jesus knew who he was.
Yeah.
He knew where he had come from. He knew where he was going. That internal wholeness.
Yes.
So vibrant, so vital.
Hey, I want to invite you, if you are listening and thinking, I have so many questions I would like to ask. We would love to address your questions on an upcoming episode. In fact, we may do an entire episode on the one question that you have. If you will simply email us at redinkrevival@gmail.com. We will catalog all of these questions, and we would love to be able to address the things on your heart and on your mind. So be sure to get in touch with us, and we'll take the journey together. Well, that makes me think about that phrase you mentioned where he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. The idea of forgiveness is, it's interesting. When I talk to people today about the word forgive, it's like they go from the 5-yard line of a football field all the way to the other 5-yard line all in a blink of an eye. And it's like, let's slow that down. Let's come back and act like we've never heard of what it is to forgive. And let's have fresh eyes on it. Because the word forgive means to release a debt. That's what it means.
Yeah.
I struggled with that for some years in the scientific kind of templates I like to look at stuff with, and I thought, what debt am I releasing them from? Because I don't want somebody to get hurt. If you do me wrong, which you've done multiple times on the basketball court, but if you do me wrong,
can we talk about that?
That's a whole episode by itself.
That would take 10 sessions.
But if you do something wrong to me, my personality itself is not one where I want you hurt. I don't want you to pay a price for what you did to me. Here's where I'm at pain. I'm at pain because what you did to me causes me to question my own sense of identity. and I don't know who I am now. I don't know what to think about me. Am I in danger? Am I at risk? Will I survive? Will I belong in the future? Because if I can't figure this out to why you did that to me, then I'm going to have it cycle again in my mind. So to release the debt is I'm releasing you from the responsibility to reset me to the pre-injury that you did to me. And the forgiveness part is that now in psychological terms, therapeutic terms, I differentiate. I'm not you, you're not me. What you did to me it's much bigger than something about me.
And it doesn't define you.
And it doesn't define me because I now then recognize that what you did to me doesn't make me that, whatever that is. And that I can turn to the gospel, I can turn to Jesus, I can turn to a group of friends and become completely restored and reset in my sense of self, my identity, my wholeness, and you do not even have to participate in it.
Right.
Now, if you desire to participate in it, we can go through the restoration processes to be able to have that. Well, when we talk about it that way, what can happen is that we set ourselves up in this idea of releasing the debt. You don't owe me anything. I now then can begin to emotionally process out of the pain and live in the hope of tomorrow.
Is it fair to say that restoration involves two, forgiveness may just involve one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, I love that. And so, if when we use the word forgiveness, if we're thinking, well, I haven't forgiven because I still have this emotional pain, well, no, what that means is that you're still working through the recovery process of your identity. The actual act of forgiving is I'm releasing you from the debt. So Jesus is on the cross and he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. And like you say, the thing that they didn't know what they do, people don't know what they're driven by.
Right.
They don't know why that they have postured the world the way they have. And Jesus is simply saying who I am, my purpose on this planet, what I'm about to do in the finalization of it is finished, and then I'm going to go into the grave and I'm going to conquer death, hell, and the grave, be resurrected. I don't need your participation at all. And so forgive them. I release them from the debt for me to go do what I need to do next. It's in that differentiation that freedom, can happen. And I find that is one of the biggest problems for all of us humans is if, when we're kids, mom and dad's emotions, we like to, I grew up in church, and so my dad could just give me the look. And that meant, boy, one more move, and when we get home, we're going to have some come to Jesus. And so as kids, we grow up feeling and needing to feel the emotions of our parents and then catalyzing that for the way we live our lives. It'll keep us safe. But as we get older, we're supposed to become independent so that we ultimately can become interdependent. And what happens in our brains, though, is our brains are not used to that adaptation. And so we don't know how to be in a relationship and somebody be in emotional distress and allow it and to realize that's you. Tony, you're in emotional distress right now. You're in pain, you're angry, you're irritated, you're frustrated. And I can be fully differentiated and realize, wait, you're that. Now because I'm differentiated from you, I can serve you.
Yeah.
I can explore you.
You're not entangled
I'm
in
not
it.
enmeshed.
Enmeshed,
I'm not in that where I own your emotions. And we do it in marriage and pastors. We do it, leaders, we do it all the time.
Yeah.
When a congregant has an emotional distress, we're like, well, what am I going to do to address that? Well, maybe I don't need to address it. Maybe I just need to tune into who they are.
Yeah.
Stay differentiated. If you're upset, that you're upset. I'm not upset.
Right.
You're upset, but I can then lean in and explore them.
Right.
Tell me more about why you're upset. Otherwise, I would be triggered, and then it's a power play.
You become part of the answer instead of being part of the problem.
Yes.
When you don't differentiate, when you're enmeshed, then you become part of the problem, and
Yes.
and people will
Yes.
throw blame off and things of that nature, and so that's a much better approach.
It so is, and
Yeah.
and I know for me, it gets real personal, and when I start feeling threatened in survival or belonging, I have been trained in some of the leadership models that I have been around throughout my life. I've been trained. What you do is you take the upper hand. It's instinct. It's intuitive. Take the upper hand, and I have enough gifting and skill that I can squash just about anything. But then what you have is collateral damage, and the people that you gave your life for now then are injured. And all they needed was to be seen, to be felt, to be heard.
Yeah, to be valued.
Not even to do what they need to be done.
Yeah.
I mean, and I've asked people before, I've said, you're upset. I'm curious, are you upset because of the decision that I made? Or are you upset because how I made the decision made you feel less than? Because those are two different things. If you're upset because of the decision itself, then you understand that as a leader, I don't get any margin on that.
Right.
But if you're upset because you felt like that I just blew you off or that I dominated you, or let's talk about that because we're in a relationship. So that's back to your book. This is back to this whole concept about relationship leading.
Yeah. And if it be possible, as
it be
much as it
possible.
depends on you, you can only do your part.
Yeah.
And the wisdom and the skills, the knowledge, gives you more opportunity, maybe some other inroads that you might not have had did you not know what you know.
Yeah.
But even so, Paul uses that word if. Because
if it be possible.
if it's possible, as much as it depends on you, meaning there's another side of this. There's a two-way street,
right.
and you don't have total control over what that other person, but what happens when it becomes toxic?
Yeah, talk about it.
What happens when it becomes deliberate?
Yeah.
And Paul, he talks about Timothy, he talks about Demas has forsaken me. He says Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring, there's a restored relationship.
Yep.
And then he says something interesting. He says to Timothy, he says, Alexander the coppersmith has done me much harm.
Yeah.
One translation says, has shown bitter hostility toward me.
Wow.
And then he tells Timothy, he doesn't say, Timothy, just keep loving it, reach out to him. And he says, Timothy, watch out for the guy.
Yeah.
Now, Jesus had said, be wise as serpent, but harmless as a dove.
Yeah.
There's a time where you have to be wise as a serpent.
Yeah.
And there were times, people don't realize this, but there were times where Jesus flat walked out of a city.
Yeah.
There were times when he walked away from a crowd because they were trying to hurt him.
Yeah. Yeah.
You say, well, Jesus, he gave himself to be crucified. When it was time, he did. And honestly, we're not called to bear the sins of the world. Jesus had kind of a unique mission in that regard. But Paul removed himself from hostile situations. Jesus did, Paul did. And Christians need to know it's okay when you need to protect yourself.
Absolutely.
It's okay.
Yeah. That's healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
It is somebody knowing, again, differentiated who I am, who I'm not, and in the boundary, being able to say, I know what I want, and I know what I don't want, and I'm tuned into my sense of emotional self, that when I feel that I'm under threat of people taking a chunk of my heart and soul, that I now can create a boundary. And a boundary is never about vengeance. It's never about retribution. A boundary is that I find when my heart is protected, I'll love you better. I'll serve you better. I'll have integrity or an alignment. I'll be able to bring my best to the relationship. So I look at the scriptures, I look at Jesus, and he was the master of boundaries. And just because somebody wanted something didn't mean that he gave it to them.
Right.
Even when the people would come and say things like, ask a question, and Jesus knew the question that they were asking, he said, I'll tell you what, you answer this question, I'll answer that one.
Yeah.
And they got together, whispered, and said, no, we're going to be in a double bind either way. We're not answering that question. Jesus said, I ain't answering it either.
Yeah.
Let me break in one more time and tell you about RedInkRevival.com, REDINK Revival.com. I want to encourage you to sign up for our blog e-newsletter there, as every month it will hit your inbox with a provocative blog post with topics about theology, biblical architecture for emotions, and how understanding the human brain is so helpful in giving more insights to various biblical texts. We also will feature updates on our monthly events to help you keep up on the ready for everything that is available to you. Also, I'd like to remind you, if this podcast is serving you with valuable insights, to subscribe to the podcast. If you think someone else would benefit from it, please review it, comment, and share it on your social media platforms. If your friends are privileged to know what's helping you, who knows what God might do in their life with the same resources. That would be a gift to us, and it would be a gift to all your friends. We're holding you in our hearts and believing God with you for a year of supernatural increase. And most of us would feel the need to emotionally satisfy something.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That is a boundary.
But he knew when people were manipulative.
He did.
He knew when people had ulterior motives.
Yes.
You know, the guy comes and says, Jesus, there's an estate between my brother and I. Divide it.
Yeah.
And Jesus just turns and says to the crowd, beware of covetousness. He didn't even deal with the guy's real question.
Yeah.
He dealt with the guy's motive.
Yeah.
One time they came and, to make him king. And he said, I'm not being a part of this. I didn't come to do this. And some people think that being a Christian means that you have to be a doormat.
Right.
That you have to let everybody manipulate you, walk on you, trample on you, things like that. And there are times that we choose to give ourselves sacrificially.
Yes.
But there are also times when it's perfectly okay for us to establish the boundaries that you're talking about. And that's what Paul did with Timothy. He said, Alexander has a track record of abusing me.
Yeah.
Watch out for the guy.
Yeah. And that wasn't unloving.
Right.
In fact, it's the most loving thing you can do is to acknowledge and recognize that. With these boundaries, when we set them up, what we're doing is, again, we're stepping into free moral agency. So if somebody's going to manipulate or hurt us, and we know that that's coming, to become victims to it. You're a victim anytime you don't choose it.
Right.
To choose to allow, that's just got to happen because this is the role, this is my job description. Anytime you do that, you are actually not being a good steward of the image of God and the glory of God for which He's put in you. For somebody to attack you in the ways that would make them feel better is actually the vulnerability you're offering people to attack the glory of God that's in you.
Right.
We've got to be people who are stewards of that in us. One of the things that really helped me some years back is to realize that if I need a boundary around a relationship today, that doesn't mean the same boundary constriction will be there a year from now.
Right.
That as I grow and become a healthier, aligned and integrated person, that what used to trigger or send me off now doesn't. And then I can, because honestly, there's some places you walk into, this is going to, the relationships here and the people that'll be here that don't have emotional intelligence, this is a 10-minuter. I'm going to be able to be here 10 minutes. And then I need to go into it knowing, hey, this is a 10-minute experience, and then I need to get out of here so I can stay healthy. Yeah. So that I can love everybody that, I love them well. But it's a 10-minute one. Well, over time, when you learn more about what goes into people being the way they are and why they are the way they are, the next thing you know, you'll be in an environment like that, and a year later, you may even be able to be there 30 minutes, and it's just entertaining.
Yeah.
And when somebody's doing their crazy, they're activating in what maybe could be called the demon dialogues. They're just working these verbiages and things, and you can just be like, that is so wild and fascinating as to what they do. But you've got to honor where you're at today.
Yeah.
Because the healthiest you is the most glorifying to God.
Yeah. And we talked about self-awareness.
Yes.
You know, what is your pain threshold?
That's it.
You know, what can you handle? When Paul says, if it's possible, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men.
That's a good word.
Paraphrase of that in my mind is, do the best you can with what you have to work with.
Yes. Yes.
Not everything's going to be an optimum relationship.
Yeah.
Not everybody, you know, the Bible we were talking about all these relationships earlier that went horrible in the Bible, you know.
Yeah.
But what about the good ones? You know, what about Jonathan loved David as his own soul, and they made a covenant.
Yes.
We might have a couple of those relationships in life.
Yeah.
We're not going to have that level of relationship with everybody.
Yeah.
And I think some people set themselves up for disappointment because they think, I'm just going to have this meaningful, fulfilling relationship with everybody.
Yeah.
And boy, you talk about set up for disappointment.
Yeah.
We're going to have, probably most people in life are going to have a few really meaningful relationships and, you know, all that. But who has time to have hundreds of those?
Yeah.
We don't have that. Maybe in heaven we'll have that.
Right.
But not here.
Not here. Well, I think too about Jesus having 12 disciples,
Yeah.
and an inner circle of 3, Peter, James, and John. And then, you know, John himself puts himself as the beloved, so
Yes.
the best friend. But you think of that.
He called himself that.
So he did.
Yeah. Jesus just called him the Son of Thunder.
That's right. But I think about what would it be like if you were number 13?
Yeah.
And that means you didn't get to be chosen.
Yeah.
And you didn't travel with him. And what if you are one of the 12, but you're not number 4?
Yeah. Andrew, I think, is an amazing example because he was a disciple of Jesus before Peter was. Peter and Andrew are brothers. And Andrew brought Peter to Jesus. And then Peter becomes a favorite, and Andrew doesn't. You know, James and John, Peter, James, and John, but Andrew, those 4 were in a fishing business together.
Yeah, right.
And Andrew doesn't become one of the top 3. But he could have had so much envy, but we never see that from Andrew.
That's fascinating.
We never see that from Andrew.
That's fascinating.
So,
Yeah, that's amazing. And we don't typically think about relationships in that kind of way. You know, I heard somebody say this, that if you need something or someone, if you need them for you to be emotionally okay, it is an expression of your wounds. If you need it. That's completely different than I desire it.
right.
You know, so when, as pastors and ministers, if you're in a group where there's somebody you'd like to know, you'd like to have friendship with, I think it's very healthy for you to like it, want it, desire it. But at what point you need it for you to be back to an integrated self, to a person who feels like I can be radically accepting of me and my imperfections, I can be compassionate and kind to myself, I can love me with a love that God loves me with. If I have to have this as a prerequisite for me to have radical acceptance of self, that if that person doesn't like me, I can't be regulated. I can't be healthy emotionally. Then what you're dealing with is a wound profile that's driving you to do something or be something that that you think will satisfy you, but we all know what it's like to finally get whatever the thing or the relationship is, and then be like, is this all this is?
Yeah.
So when I look at like Andrew, I think that the way he would be able to metabolize the whole, I wasn't in the top 3 inner circle, and my brother leapfrogged me.
Yeah.
That he would have to be somebody who could, regulate that with, I desire that, but at the same time, I love me. And I don't love me as in a narcissistic love, because a narcissistic love is, again, a wound expression that I have to do something, organize something for me to be okay. and that's the presenting of myself as the center of everything that goes on. But when it comes to a person who is loving themselves well, it just means that I'm honest about my imperfections. I'm honest about my flaws. Yet I realize that if God loved me the way that He loves me, I'm going to leverage that and say, I don't have to perform one thing. I don't have to do anything or be anything other than me for me to love myself well and to be kind, compassionate, empathetic, and even trust myself.
Yeah.
And that's where I believe grace comes in to help us in our human weakness.
Yeah. People will ultimately be imperfect because we're imperfect. We don't perfectly meet anybody else's needs. We weren't designed to.
Yeah.
We're called to love one another, encourage one another, but nowhere does the Bible say, I'm going to be your all in all.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to be your, and Paul, when we come to the close of this chapter, and I alluded to this earlier, toward the end of the chapter, Paul says, at my first trial, nobody stood with me. All men forsook me. And then he said, may it not be laid to their charge. So the forgiveness thing.
Yeah.
But then, because he would have liked to have had that support.
Yeah.
Everybody likes moral support, partnership, encouragement. But he says, nobody stood with me. Everybody forsook me.
Yeah.
And then he said this. He said, but the Lord stood with me.
Yeah.
And strengthened me so that I was able to, preach this message and so on. And ultimately what we have to realize is that people, they may do the best they can, but they're never going to meet every need that we have. They weren't supposed to meet every need that we have. If somebody does, I'm wondering if there's idolatry involved, But the Lord is, the Bible says it's better to trust in the Lord than to trust in princes.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes the reason we have so much disappointment, when somebody doesn't meet our needs is because we had expectations of them that they can't fulfill with their own human limitations. And we can be angry, we can be, instead of realizing, maybe they were doing the best they could and that was just all they were capable of. And maybe my disappointment is because I was expecting something from them that ultimately only God can provide to me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so fascinating when you see even like married couples and they are needing the other one to meet that need. They have a need, they want the other one to meet that need.
Right.
And there's times that you've been able to get into the coaching of that interaction and be able to say, now this need that you have that you want them to meet, have you ever been able to meet it yourself? And if they can't meet it themselves, how in the world is another human going to meet the need you can't meet on your own?
Yeah.
And then you take that and put it into the context of leadership and what many of us as pastors and leaders have needed in terms of making us feel okay with who we are, our season of life, our sense of self, that we often think, I got to have a church. I need to have a mega church. And if I don't, I failed. And you have to stop and ask, well, who says that? Who said that that's the measurement? There's a need that your historical story has actually provided or created for you. There's a need there that you're chasing, and you think numbers are going to do it, and it's not.
Right.
When I was in junior high, actually in 6th grade, we moved to a little town in Arkansas. My dad had been in the Air Force, and in 7th grade, went out for the basketball team, small town, so our basketball coach for the high school was also our junior high coach. And he's in the Hall of Fame today. He played with Elgin Baylor, and he played with...
Who just passed away.
He did.
Yeah.
And Oscar Robertson, he guarded Oscar.
One of the best players of all time.
Yes. And he would tell the story.
From Indiana.
Because you are and you're such a basketball guru. He said that he was an All-American, my coach, and he guarded Oscar. And first time down, they played the NCAA tournament over in Lawrence, Kansas. And first time Oscar comes down top of the key, jumps up, jump shot, banks it straight ahead, banks it in. And my coach said, yeah, I thought, you dog, you're so lucky, there's no way. And then my coach said 56 points later, I realized he was trying to bank it. So this is the coach, and I'm in junior high in little town, and so he's the coach of the junior high as well. I'm the only seventh grader that doesn't make the junior high team. The only seventh grader. And so I didn't like basketball at the time, but I thought if I'm ever going to have currency in this town, if I'm ever going to have some sense of survival, I got to get on my game. So I started playing every day.
Yeah.
I'd get the key from the coach and go to the gym, and went to basketball camps. And by the time I'm in ninth grade, I make all district, had the leather jacket, had the patches, all that stuff. And I remember thinking, if I could ever get that, it would calm the torment of I'm not enough, I'm not valuable, and I could relax. And I remember making all district and having the jacket and the patches, and some of my friends, most of my friends, I was only one of three, I think, that got the jacket with the patches. And I thought, I remember sitting there looking at that accomplishment and thinking, this is so empty.
Yeah.
This isn't doing anything for me. This is so unsatisfying. And I think even in ministry, we have those moments where we think, if I just could grow this church to 500 or to 1,000. And what's funny is it doesn't matter how big you are, you're not big enough. So if you've got 5,000, well, have you seen some of the bigger churches that are 15, 20,000? Well, if you're 20,000, you look at a church like, T.D. Jakes or Joel Osteen, they got 50,000. And so then you go to the 50,000, and if you're those guys, you're looking at, Dr. Cho, and you're thinking, we still don't have much going on.
Yeah.
The torment will never go away if you need it and you're being driven to it.
It is a hamster wheel.
A hamster wheel. So I love what you're talking about, even around, as much as that is in you. So what is in you? What is in you that, are you tuning into yourself? Are you aware of what's happening and what you're feeling and what you're experiencing in a cognitive narrative? Because once you do that, then you can know that as much as in you, you can be at peace with all men. I love that. Well, is there anything else that you want to kind of put on the table before we wrap it up?
Well, we've probably worn out the saints already, but this has really been rich, and it stirred me up on some things from several of the perspectives you shared. And
well, likewise.
So I hope it helps all the people that listen and watch, and because ultimately ministry is people business, and our job is to bring out the best in everybody that we possibly can. And, Paul went his whole ministry, and we only read about 2 times where he turned somebody over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh.
Yeah.
I've known pastors that do that anytime somebody leaves their church.
I've done it to you.
Yeah.
I've turned you over.
And you notice it didn't work. But
I'm still trying to figure that out.
But we should always lead with love,
Yes.
but we can't do that unless we've got some degree.
So good.
And we're all learning, we're all growing, and but some semblance of healthiness on the inside. Because bottom line is, it comes out, Peter said, such as I have, give I thee. And if all we have on the inside is tension and turmoil and drivenness, that's what we'll communicate to other people.
Absolutely.
But if we found peace and genuine joy and contentment, then we can minister that to others.
Tony, so good, man. I so love you and so appreciate the wisdom and the gifts that are in you. Of course, I feel very close to you as a friend, and I'm grateful for all the years. We said today we've been friends for 35 years.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Can't believe you're that old. And and I've very much enjoyed.
I'm wounded now.
So now you have to release the debt. That's on you, not me. So, but again, just thank you so much. And thank you for, you've been a guest before, but thank you for being a part of the Red Ink Revival team.
Thank you.
Just allowing it to be a conversation.
Yeah. And I really believe in what you're doing. I think you've got some awesome traction here. And I'm sure for many people, when they hear some things, what you're doing, it's, to borrow an old adage, it's like a cow at a new gate.
Yeah.
But all truth is God's truth.
Come on. I love that.
And so there's a lot to be mined and cultivated and benefited. And I learned years ago from a couple psychologist friends, because they were telling me how they integrate their Christian faith and their counseling practice. And they were talking to me about their philosophy, which they call spoiling the Egyptians. And they bring out the fact that, when Israel left Egypt, they'd been slaves for 400 and some years, and that tabernacle they built was built with Egyptian gold.
Yeah.
And their idea is, you take the best that the world has to offer, not unbiblical stuff, not ungodly stuff, but just observational truth.
Yeah.
And you spoil the Egyptians, and you combine the best that the world has to offer, that is not ungodly, that is not unbiblical, and the tools, the biblical truth, and you can come up with some methodologies of helping people by connecting with them in really helpful ways, and I really think that's what you're doing.